Well, I'm Thabiti Anyabwile, and you're on the front porch. Thank you for joining us on the porch. We're in Louisville, Kentucky. It's December 30th, and we're here at the Cross Conference, Student Missions Conference, and got some time with my brother Carl Ellis on the porch. Man, thank you for joining us and chopping it up a bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about missions, and African American missions in particular, and the history of that missions. You've had a wide sort of intellectual history or intellectual interest in things theological, anthropological, cultural, historical. You're a theological anthropologist. You're working as an assistant professor at Redeemer Seminary.
That's right.
And the author of at least 3 books that come to mind for me: Free at Last, which is an exploration of the gospel and the African American experience, Saving Our Sons, which is a good treatment of really reclaiming black boys.
Yeah, that's right.
And then also your book on missions, Going Global. Going global. So you've been thinking about the history and the present in terms of missions and the black church and so on. So maybe the place to start, because there'd be some people watching this for whom this is a new conversation, maybe the place to start is just a definition of missions. How would you define missions?
I would just say missions is seeking to make disciples of all nations. That's it. Now of course you can break that down, but basically that's it. It's all about discipleship. You can disciple individuals, and you can disciple cultures.
Okay.
And we must be involved with both. I mean, if we're gonna do the Great Commission, there's 2 strategies we use. One, we impact the individual, hoping that they will impact the culture. The other is to impact the culture, hoping it'll impact the individual. Well, it's a both and, And I think, unfortunately, we have concentrated on the first one and never got to the second one. But there are some of us who are called to actually impact the culture too, and that kind of thing. So, if you look at the Bible, you see that. You see Daniel was a man who impacted the whole culture of a whole superpower. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then eventually impacted the cultures of the world. There were things that happened in the world, in Persia, India, China, and other places, that it was affected by what Daniel did in Babylon, because of course Nebuchadnezzar, once he had his experiences, he had that stuff broadcast to the whole wide world. You know what I'm saying? So
which creates certain plausibility structures for the gospel
right,
itself.
Right,
so I think that's right. So you're looking, there's a way in which the gospel, because we're made in God's image, affirms things about us culturally.
That's right.
And there are ways in which the gospel cuts across things because we're fallen in the culture.
We are fallen as individuals. Our cultures are fallen.
That's right.
But God has never left himself without a witness.
Amen.
In every single culture on the face of this earth, there are truths that God has planted there that have been there forever. Now, people try to cover them up and suppress them and all the rest of that, but they're there. And so one of the jobs that we have to do is to go in there and dig out those truths, discover those truths. Sometimes it'll take decades to take away the stigma that surrounds them, but sometimes it's right there. It's right in plain sight. And so we can use those as jumping off places, as points of contact, and then we begin to build our gospel presentation around those things.
Amen. And as I said a moment ago, for some people this is kind of new conversation in our context, but it's not really new to the black church. The work of missions and doing the work of missions.
We have a great history of missions.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's maybe take it in 100-year increments. So we're thinking 1750 to 1850, roughly.
Okay.
Late 1700s, you get the rise of independent black churches.
That's right.
1816, you get the first black denomination.
That's right.
So talk about the early sort of missions emphasis as a part of that history.
Yeah, well, starting, of course, America's first missionary was an African American.
That's right.
And
George Liles.
George Liles.
That's right.
I was going to say Henry Island Garnett, but he came later.
That's right.
That's right. Well, see, this all came out of a theological concept in the North. There were 2 African American theologies. There was a Southern theology of suffering, which was in the Exodus paradigm, and there was a Northern theology of empowerment, which was in the paradigm of the exile. Okay, and now, of course, both of these theologies were, the central to those theologies was salvation by grace through faith and all of that stuff. but at the same time, it kind of had a different theme. So up north, they saw themselves as part of the African diaspora, part of the scattering of Africans. And they were trying to figure out, why on earth are we here in the first place? Because we didn't ask to come here. And so, we weren't First Nations and we weren't immigrants.
Didn't chip in on the gas money or nothing.
Exactly. We're just here. That's right. So why on earth are we here? So they wrestled with that, and they began to read the scriptures, and they began to, they saw Joseph. He didn't choose to go to Egypt, but that was very significant, him being in Egypt. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in Babylon. They didn't choose to go there, but yet and still their presence there had global significance, global divine significance. So they said, well, then our presence here, since we know Christ, then our presence here must have some kind of a significance. And so therefore, they came up with they saw this. They said, well, we are here that we might carry the gospel of Jesus Christ to the rest of the African diaspora, the rest of the people of African descent all over the place. And so out of that came a great missions movement on the part of African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, by the way.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's right.
And that was really, really, really a very key thing, because you see, now the way they carried out missions, so many of them would not just send one or two out somewhere. They transplant whole churches.
That's right. That's right. There's churches planting churches.
Exactly right. It was just the whole, and then so in the mid 1800s, you'd be hard pressed to find an African American who did not have a close relative, a brother or sister, aunt or uncle, or somebody who wasn't involved on the continent, involved in missions.
Yeah. So in the history, there is this profound sense that now, having gone through the sufferings of the Middle Passage and slavery and all that entailed, and by God's providence come in contact with the gospel, there's this profound sense that now something's owed to the rest of the diaspora in the way of taking the gospel.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So that was an incredible thing, and out of that came men like Henry Highland Garnett, W.C. Pennington, James Theodore Holly. All these were reformed, trained ministers, and they were very much involved in all of that. So it was quite a movement. So when emancipation came in the South, then the Southern Church, no longer we're coming out of Egypt, we're et cetera, et cetera. The Southern Church began to buy into the Northern theology of empowerment, and so a lot of Southern African Americans got involved in that great thrust too. Yeah. Now,
No, it's good, man. Good. Yeah. So
what changed the whole story was so between 1875 and 1900, everything changed. A couple of things happened. First, the end of the Reconstruction in the South. Yeah. All right, and of course you know what that was a major setback. That's right, major setback. The rise of Jim Crow, the rise of the new form of slavery called the sharecropper system, terrorism, and all the rest of that. Okay, up north you had the Industrial Revolution, the effects of that, which required a lot of labor, but the industrialists didn't want to hire, they didn't want to have an African-American workforce so much, so they encouraged European immigration, which led to white-only trade unions. So here are these people with all these trade skills who were locked out of the skilled labor force by the trade unions. That was the second thing, but the big one in terms of missions was the fact that, of course, the Industrial Revolution hit in Europe too, and all of a sudden there was this great need for raw materials and all that. Of course, they quickly ran out of the raw materials in Europe, so they had to go to Africa. And so colonialism intensified in Africa. And of course, at first, the colonial powers were fighting and feuding among themselves until they settled their disputes at the Conference of Berlin in 1884 and 85. And there they carved up sub-Saharan Africa, and then they got to work with, serious, intense colonialism. And of course, that put them in conflict with these African American and Afro-Caribbean missionaries who were in Africa. So, to make a long story short, they ended up expelling all black missionaries from Africa and denying entry to any new ones. And so, within about a 10-year period, there, this whole massive missions movement was just decimated. And it was so traumatic that I think the African American church went into, I would call a missions coma for at least 100 years.
That's a good phrase, and that feels like what it is. There's this sleepiness now about this issue.
Exactly. So you go today. I want to be a missionary, and they say, "What's that?" Is this no? And of course, people think that today, people who know what missionaries are, they might think they're old ladies wearing white dresses collecting pennies.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I wonder if you've had this sense too. And the term missions has been kind of contracted to domestic community service, community issues. Exactly. Now, in the longer history, of course, exactly, and in the longer history, of course, that the African American church really didn't have any problem having a dual focus on, say, the emancipation, freedom, development of African Americans at home and the investment in missions. Now it seems like those things, people sort of feel those things to be a conflict.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, because it's the zero-sum myth. You know, if I give something over here, then I'm going to have to subtract that much over here.
That's exactly right.
When we can you can't be balanced. You can't be balanced if you're only focused overseas or if you're only focused domestically. You have to have both.
That's right. That's
so
right. And I like that you frame it as a zero-sum myth because in God's economy, the more you give, the more enriched you are.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And then God does not deal with arithmetic increase; He deals with multiplication.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Now, as you sort of studied and thought about missions and missions history in the African American context, a couple of questions come to mind. If people want to sort of think about this more, any resources you would recommend, things to read, resources on websites, so on and so forth?
Gosh, the stuff that I was able to pull together from to do that book, Going Global, just scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
One of the things I pulled out there was a publication called The Colored American. I think it was only in circulation for about 4 or 5 years, or something like a magazine. And they would have these quotations from these theologians, these African American Northern theologians.
Yeah.
Of course, Going Global would be a good place.
So your book definitely
to go.
Definitely.
And then what else? See, our missions history has just been overlooked by the missiologists, and I don't understand. Well, I do understand. I mean, this is the same old story. Isn't it?
It is the same story. I kind of chuckle when they start American missions with Adoniram Judson.
Exactly.
30 years after George Lyle.
And
the sort of privilege that rationalized that by saying, well, that was the first agency that sent someone. As if Jesus had a missions agency other than the church, So that history gets overlooked. I think about Leroy Fitz's book, The History of Black Baptists.
Yes,
he's got some good chapters in there as well.
That's right. There's several resources. It's funny about George Lyle. I was this was several years ago. Because George Lyle is instrumental in African American church history, right? So I was doing a lecture in Barbados. And because I was trying to figure out whatever happened to George Lyle, he just seemed like he disappeared or something, And so I was there and I was talking. I forgot exactly what I was talking about. And I mentioned George Lyle. People from all over the Caribbean were there, and I mentioned George Lyle. So, we know him.
Mention that name, and it's alive, man. I mean, the way the Lord blessed His work in Jamaica. Going with George Bacon and some others, starting the Baptist work there.
That's right.
The growth of the Baptist work is tremendous, man. It's tremendous.
He preached like George Whitefield. I heard.
That's exactly right. And held to solid biblical theology.
Absolutely.
Instrumental in helping Europeans think about how to do missions in the Caribbean.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, you see agencies like the African Inland Mission. Exactly. The Sudan Interior Mission. Why is it inland? Why is it interior? What's going on? By the time the Europeans got there, the black missionaries had the coast all tied up. And so in order to get to the interior, they had to have black missionaries help them get in and get them introduced. But their names were never recorded. But yet, and so that was...
lots of, like so much of our history, lots of lost history.
Lots of it.
Folks should think about Lot Carey and Mission Society there, things of that sort. So, thinking about this from a historical perspective, maybe we'll wrap up on this question. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lessons from the history that you would say ought to be applied in the context now as we think about being the church, being the black church in particular, and playing our part in our Lord's Great Commission? Any lessons from history?
I'm going to take a lesson from biblical history.
Excellent. Even better.
That God has a unique purpose for not only for every individual, but He also has a unique purpose for every people group.
Mm-hmm.
And when God's purposes for that people group are complete, that people group goes out of existence.
Yeah.
I've never met a Hittite.
Right.
You know.
That's right.
I might have met some descendants of one, but I've never met it because the purposes are complete. So the very fact that African Americans exist today, that purpose is still there. Now, I think that I'm getting some hints. Every time I go overseas, I get the same question, just like we heard earlier. Where are the black missionaries? I hear that all the time in Asia, Africa, Latin America, everywhere. Okay, God, I'm just kind of speculating here. God has given us a story that a lot of people around the world want to hear. And a lot of people want to hear how God brought us from a mighty long way.
How we got over.
How we got over. I think that's a very. So I think that we have an incredible opportunity to be very instrumental in fulfilling the Great Commission. When in Matthew 24, where Jesus says that this gospel of the kingdom will be preached and all the world is witness, and then the end will come. I think African Americans can play a significant role in that. I'm not saying we're the only ones who can do that, but I'm saying that we have a significant role to play there. We can blow that like other people have blown it. You know what I'm saying? I think some people are going over there taking advantage of that, bringing forth a false gospel, such as the health and wealth stuff and all that. But if we act now, I think we can really do have a significant impact. So from biblical history, I see all these people groups, and I see, of course, in Revelation 7, I see them all there. They're all gathered. They're not just one bland people plasma. How do we know every nation, tribe? And so I think that's the one big lesson I would learn. That I would take. But the thing is that we have to get beyond seeing. We got to stop just meditating on our navels. We need to start becoming aware of what's going on in the world. Now, the other thing, too, the other great lesson is this. We know about suffering.
That's right. That's right.
The church in much of the world, especially in the Muslim world, is suffering terribly. And we need to be champions of the suffering church. And I think we can make a very good championship because our brothers and sisters are being slaughtered, and it's a shame, what's going on. So I think those are two great things that we can all be involved in missions in that sense, So
no, that's good. That's
church.
good, and that experience with suffering should allow us to do, as you're saying, at least three things. One is be champions for the suffering church. And two is go suffer.
That's right. And we have a theology of suffering, that a history of it.
That's exactly
one of the strongest strands of our theology is the theology of suffering.
That's exactly right.
As a matter of fact, it was the civil rights movement. That theology of suffering is what gave the civil rights movement the power that it had.
That's right.
A lot of people didn't realize how theological the civil rights movement was, but it was. And so I think we have some tremendous tools at our disposal.
It's not until Dr. King talks about suffering being redemptive.
Exactly. Undeserved suffering is redemptive.
Yeah. It's not until he brings that onto the scene that America has thought much at all about suffering and theology. And so we've got a great legacy to contribute in the work of missions, which is really making Jesus known.
That's right.
Our suffering servant, our suffering Messiah.
Our suffering servant.
Making him known to the nations.
It was an African who was the last one to carry the cross of Christ.
That's right.
So I wonder if that has echoes.
That's a good point.
And wonder if it has prophetic echoes. I don't know.
Amen. No, that's good. Yeah. That's good. And we've all got to pick up our cross and carry it daily.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you for carrying your cross, brother, and laboring for the Lord. Thank you for joining us on the porch, man.
Hey,
we need to do this again, man.
I love the weather.
What? Well, we need to do this again. Next time, we need to do it on a porch in the Cayman Islands.
Now you're talking. You just let me know now.
Thank you guys for joining us on the front porch. If you enjoyed this and you want to go a little bit further, you might also check out the interview with Tim Bird, Nia Bird, and Byron Johnson on sort of how to get from here to there. You're thinking you might have a call. You appreciate this history, want to play your part in it. That'd be a great video to check out as well. God bless you and keep you.